Well, first, it's only fair to say welcome back after half term. Probably doesn't seem like much of a holiday since you've probably not really been able to do anything much different, but at least you had a break. So where do we go as we move forward? We've got a bit of a slowdown for the next couple of weeks again, which I'm sure you'll be happy with, allowing us to go over some of the things we've done before. So today I am going to be going over Brown versus Topeka. Now, this is all about retrieval. At the moment, we have looked at the first part of the civil rights movement. We've looked at Brown versus Topeka. We've looked at Little Rock. We need to go back over that, make sure that we fully understand it. And we're going to do that for the next 2 weeks. We're going to focus on retrieval and on the strengthening of our knowledge and our exam skills. This week, we are going to review Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Topeka, and there is going to be a quiz at the end of that. And then next week, we are going to look at exam skills and how useful questions. And then the week after that, we are going to go back over Little Rock and look at progress up until the 1950s in general. What I don't want you to think is that this means that we haven't got anything to do for the next 3 weeks. Completely the opposite. At the end of this week, you're going to have a quiz that needs to be submitted. At the end of next week, there is going to be an 8-mark useful question that needs to be submitted. And at the end of week 3, there is also going to be a piece of work that I need to have submitted from you, slightly different in that particular case. But plenty to do, but hopefully this will help you to really focus on what you've already learned and make sure that you've learned it in a bit more detail and a bit more thoroughly so that it stays in your brain. So let's go back to the very beginning and remind ourselves of Plessy versus Ferguson. I can't stress to you enough how important it is that you understand this. So this case comes about in 1896, and it is all about the idea of separate but equal, and it's a challenge to the Jim Crow laws. So basically, this case said that as long as both whites and blacks have equal accommodation, they can legally be separated. So as long as in a restaurant there was a black side and a white side, that was absolutely fine. As long as on a bus there was a black side and a white side, that was absolutely fine. Now we start to question that idea of equal. Does it have to be exactly the same? As you know, as a result of the Plessy versus Ferguson case, we began to see signs pop up all over America, particularly in the South, some that said coloured, some that said white. So we've seen some examples of those before, and there's another one there on the right-hand side. If you watch this video, it's about 8 minutes long. It's a cartoon, but it is reasonably detailed and it is reasonably in-depth about the Plessy versus Ferguson case. It gives you an idea of who Plessy was, who Ferguson was, and a bit more detail on that. As always, I'll put that link in separately on the Google Classroom so that you're able to look at things. Now, the claim versus the reality. Separate but equal. What does that actually mean? Well, for a lot of people in reality, black schools lacked basic necessities, and children were going to black schools and they weren't being afforded the same opportunities that white children were. So, for example, in South Carolina, there were schools with no running water, no flushing toilets and no electricity. We're not sitting here saying, oh wow, your school's got a posh swimming pool and ours hasn't. Basic things such as running water. And that doesn't seem to be fair. If you think about the amount of money that is spent on a child in school each year, so that each of you is allocated a certain amount of money each year to fund the school and what the school has to buy books with and pay for teachers and all those things. In one particular county, white children were worked out as $149 a year for education. So that's how much each child had to spend on them in each classroom. In the black schools down the road, they were given $43 a year. Now, we ask the question, is this separate but equal? Is that equal? And is that fair? Is that putting people at a disadvantage? So one person who definitely thought this, as you know, was the Brown versus Topeka case. So also known often as Brown versus Board, and that's what I've entitled this YouTube clip. Brown versus Board, this is where Linda Brown's father decides to take Topeka in Kansas to court. Here is a little video, again, put that in separately for you to be able to watch. It's from the same people who did the Plessy versus Ferguson one, so it does give you quite a lot of detail, but it's reasonably understandable before we move on. So Linda Brown is a 3rd grader, so it makes her about 8 years old. And she has to walk to school every day, even though there is a school closer. So in 7 blocks away from her home is Summer Elementary School, which is a white school. However, Linda Brown has to walk 6 blocks. She then has to cross train lines in order to get there. She then has to take a bus in order to get to Monroe Elementary School, which is the nearest black school. So she's having to do twice the journey, and she's having to do dangerous things like get a bus on her own, cross train lines. Her father thinks that this is absolutely ridiculous. So with the support of the NAACP, remember that group, they take her case to court, and they sue the local school and say that they want to be able to go to Summer Elementary School, which is the white school. So the case is brought forward by a chap called Thurgood Marshall. Now Thurgood Marshall works on behalf of the NAACP, and he is a lawyer. That is a name that you need to know, Thurgood Marshall. Marshall comes up later. Again, you only really need to know his surname, which is Marshall, but he is the one who's arguing for the case in the Supreme Court. Now, by the time it reaches the Supreme Court, there's been other cases brought, and they actually put them all together into one case called the Brown versus Topeka case. But they are now representing more than one. Now, let's see what they argued. Now, Marshall decided that the segregation law had led to low self-esteem amongst black children. Imagine that you are that person. If you were educated separately, then you are damaged because you are basically being stigmatized. You are saying you are different to other people. Imagine if we segregated classrooms and we sat all of one eye colour on one side and one eye colour on the other side, or we did it by hair colour, etc. It wouldn't be very kind. So it stigmatised them, and it made them feel as though they were second class. It reinforced the notion of difference. It made them feel inferior to white people, and it established the idea of racism within America. So whereas we were supposed to have an equal society now, it reinforced that idea that black people were still inferior. That had been the idea when the slavery movement existed, that movement being 100 years since it had ended, but it reinforced this idea of difference and inferiority. So this is based upon the work of Kenneth and Marnie Clark. This is where he gets this evidence from. So it's not just him making it up. There's research that's done that's proven that this is the case. And think about it. If you were in that situation, if you were a black child in a school and you were having to go to a school where there were less facilities and you weren't allowed to mix with the white people that lived perhaps around the corner from you, this could potentially make you feel very, very inferior. So it's important as a case, and it's important that this is brought forward, rather than arguing that the school had poorer facilities or that she had to walk a long way to get there. Marshall argued that the reason that they needed to go to this school was because of the psychological damage. What this meant was that they couldn't just throw money at the school and say, look, it's equal now, go away. It was about the concept of segregation as a whole. So it's not about the money. It wasn't about the facilities. He said, forget those things. That's not what's important. What's important is that these children are growing up and they are feeling inferior. That is a really, really important concept that you need to grasp. So the outcome. The Supreme Court overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson case. They argue that it violates the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment being that everybody has equal protection under the law. So in the field of public education, separate facilities are inherently unequal. This is what they find. This is their quote. Separate facilities are, by their nature, inherently unequal. They can't be. And therefore, it overturned the case and said that segregated schools were wrong and they should not be allowed. However, there are some points to go with this. The law applies only to public schools. Now, for those of you that don't know the American legal system, the American school system rather, let's get this right. In England, a public school is a posh private school like Eton. However, in America, a public school is what we go to, a state school. Okay, so a public school is what the public go to, and then they have private schools like we have. So don't think this only applies to public schools as in posh toffee-nosed schools. This is a state school, so it only applies to state schools. People who pay for their education can still do as they wish. The important thing is that the Plessy versus Ferguson rule had been successfully challenged. The Supreme Court had said, yeah, it's wrong. There is a problem with this segregation. It does affect black people's civil rights. And that's a major victory, in concept terms at least, for this early stage in the movement. But what are our limitations of it? The court said that it had to be done with all deliberate speed. What does that mean? There wasn't actually a set completion date. They hadn't said all schools have got to be desegregated by a certain date. They said it has to be done as quickly as possible. Think about all the excuses people could come up with. Oh, you know, we need to make sure that we've got the facilities. We need to make sure we've got the space. We are worried about the safety of the black children if they come to this school because of the anti-black feeling. There's lots of reasons why people put it off. It also led to the formation of white citizens' councils, of which there were 250,000 by 1956. Now, white citizens' councils were groups of people who, a bit like the NAACP, who were trying to further the rights of black people to make them equal. The white citizens' councils got together to try to make sure that those rights weren't won. So it was a counter group to the NAACP. We'll see more about these white citizens' councils before the end of this unit. They're not a great group. Linked with the KKK, so the Ku Klux Klan, this is a highly racist group, and they are revitalised. People start joining them again. People start thinking, look, we're worried about what's going on, so we are going to join this group. Desegregation varied. In the border states, there was lots. In the South, not so much. And there was a backlash. In places like Alabama, the NAACP is banned. On the upside, within a year, there are lots of schools. Over 500 schools in the North and South have desegregated, meaning that black children can go to those schools. And by 1957, there is more than 300,000 black children in formerly segregated schools. So 300,000 children now getting to go to schools that are black and white. On the downside, in the 2 years after Brown versus Board, the southern states passed over 450 laws preventing the decision from being enforced. So just little rules that meant that they couldn't actually be done. By 57, 2.4 million children were still being taught in Jim Crow schools. So although this has changed that Plessy Ferguson case and it has begun to see changes, there are certain limitations. Now, I would very, very strongly suggest that you look at the limitations, the positives and the negatives of this case, because when you come to do your 8-mark useful question next week, it's really important that you have that information. This is what the question is going to be on. It's going to be on Brown versus Board. So for you to be able to analyse that, it's important that you have this info. The quiz this week is looking at Plessy versus Ferguson and is looking at Brown versus Board. You can look through your other notes in anticipation, but hopefully this has made sense. See what you can find on the web to support your learning. If you need to ask me any questions, please feel free to email me. This is all of your work for this week. Go over this, know it really, really, really well. Make sure that you hand in your quiz. Make sure you make any revision cards. Thank you. I hope you've had a fabulous half term, and I will see you next week.